Our next topic is the development trajectory of Sabah. So through the personal history, through the collective history, through naming the eras and the ages and the periods of our evolution, there was socio-economic and political development. So what we're going to do on this wall over here, in a way, is mirror that and trace it in terms of our development. When did we do what? Someone talk about crocodile skins being sold in Europe. We talked about different products from the forests, from the seas. We talked about merchants, all these things. We talked about logging, we talked about sawit, we talked about paddy. So there were themes here already. So I think what I want to do here is pull out those main themes and then let's plot it together. When did logging start? When did it, was it small scale and then became large scale? Same with agriculture. When did we plant rubber? When did we plant cocoa? When did we plant palm? When did oil palm come in? Who were the forces? When did the Chinese come? When did they, start all these enterprises? Again, it's not a history lesson. Similarly, it's also personal. It's your people, what your people did. And then let's map it out together. We sort of want to see, again, with the whole overview in mind, how did we get into this linear extractive economy that is our current or dominant economy? How did we move away from traditional economies? How did we move away from tamus and barter and all these things? And try to do it again without this is right or this is wrong, but this is just what happened. I think what we want to unpack here is, how did we get here? Forever Sabah was founded when we asked the question in 2011, 2012, where will Sabah be if we continue on this current trajectory of development? Where will we be in 50 years? And that's what led to Forever Sabah. Everyone thought about the question and said, oh, I think we need to disrupt that trajectory because it's not going to end up in a good place. And that's what led to the work that we do, all the programs, all the projects, all of you, all that you're focusing your lives on today started with that question. So imagine that was wherever, somewhere here, 2011, 12, whatever. So now let's kind of take steps back and see, how did we get there? And that's going to help us with our conversation tomorrow. For us to refresh our understanding of the circular economy. And where are we stuck in doing that? What are the powers that be that we need to address? How are we going to do it? And of course, not everything is going to be answered. It's a conversation, and we're taking a moment to have an overview of ourselves as well, our own work, our own projects. our systems. Okay, I didn't know if to draw a line. It can be a line, doesn't have to be a line. It can be eras. It can be a flow chart. Anyone has any ideas? Some of you are good drawers. If you see any images that come to mind, any symbols that come to mind, bah, just come forward and go for it. Those of you online as well, we need you. Bah, Neville, can you talk about what you're writing?
Yeah. Dulu tidak banyak orang, and then ada abundance of natural resources, and dia cukup lah untuk semua orang dulu. Kalau back in the British punya documentations, they say endless supply. It's like it's never going to habis, all of this wealth that we have dulu. And then it helped people to make a living out of it. Ada yang bikin rumah. Dulu mana ada undang-undang, you can just cut any trees you want and make a livelihood out of it. For example, kalau in the East Coast, timber was critical to the development of large commercial fishing punya fleets, because people saw others were making more money, so they all pergi potong kayu, all bikin kapal, and there was no law to regulate any of this. But mostly people were subsistence, because no way for them to sell whatever they catch. They just live off sustainably from that. But once you have, when colonialism started, then it was all about money. It was all about catching as much as you can, and like everyone competing for the resources. So we have so many fleets back in the day. This was the golden era of Sandakan, the East Coast, from the 50s probably all the way to the 80s.
Neville, do write words, keywords also.
Okay. So when our government want to start regulating this, they come up with top-down approach. They talk about protected area. They want to put a fence on all these resources. Resources. Then it created another problem lah. But on the side, on the other side lagi, all this large fleets dulu end up scooping everything out, and then there was no more, and then there was fish catches or prawns. Back in the day, it was like very high lah, in the 70s and to the 90s, but the prices is very low. And then in the 90s, all these ships beginning to not making the profits, and then a lot of this industry, a lot of these businesses collapsed. This one collapsed, and then everyone went back to using small boats again. So now we have many little small boats who are contributing to the sources of protein for the people back in the day. But then again, whatever laws that we have, whatever laws that was introduced by the British colony was only relevant during this era. And we are still using the same one into this next 50 years or even beyond 50 years. So that's the big problem right now lah. And what else? Now catches are down. People are catching less, but but also because there's too many smaller boats now. more small boats, and the issue that they've been facing is they don't have license. And then the government of the day, because of their own punya subsidy system there, is overwhelmed. They don't want to give any more people issue more license, because more and more fishermen are going to demand for more subsidies. So hundreds and hundreds of millions are spent more and more and more and more and more and more and more as we go by. For instance, a few years ago, fishing subsidies was like close to 200 million. And then if the government recognize all the rights of more of these people, increasingly more and more people are relying on the sea as a livelihood, then it's, this means that we need a reset lah. And then access to these resources also is ada gate sudah. This is gated sudah, this reset, and then you have many laws written, blah 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 blah, after another law, but there's never an effort to look at reset, reform. So far for me itulah kalau pasal fishing. They could be more, but I'll just stop here lah.
Hi, Casey here. I sorry, I don't know much about history, and I try to read up. But I found a paper recently, very interesting. It's written by a professor of history, and let me share some facts coming from me. So it's by also I checked this person's background, and then I found that I think he knows what he's talking about. He's a professor of history, and then he did a study on Chinese in Sabah specifically. And his view is quite interesting in the sense that he felt that the British brought in Chinese in sometime like 1846, but mostly because they brought them in, mostly because they wanted a model of Singapore. They wanted a population that is enterprising, doing business, so that they can collect tax. That's the model of how the British work. They feel that if there's no businesses, no town and all that, they cannot collect tax. And when they cannot collect tax, it cannot fund the government. And then another interesting thing is that not only they can collect tax, the Chinese are also quite terrible with vices. They gamble, they take opium and all that. And again, that provides revenue to the British. Okay, I can send this paper and you can have a look. And something, I won't go through this whole paper. There's something that this paper also highlighted was that, which interests me a great deal, because in Sagama, tobacco was once a very important industry. Apparently, during the early years of the British, no agricultural crop was successful except tobacco. Tobacco was very, very, very successful. You get a lot of investment from the British, from the Germans and all that. So tobacco was the main driving force in agriculture at that time. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. Can you put opium there also?
So I speak as a British. The the British for something like 60 years, I think, had a policy where they forced Indians to grow opium, and they forced Chinese societies to be open to opium. And the purpose was to addict Chinese to opium. and to use that to generate revenue in these settlements like in Sabah, but also to keep China open for trade. So this is a long and very nasty piece of imperial history in which my family was campaigning against it at that time, but it lasted for a very, very long time. It was not an accident. It was a policy. And it was very hard to stop. So
One of his ancestors was part of stopping it or helping to stop it.
But I asked my laki, and then dia punya ancestry dari kepulauan di Filipina. Di situ kerja orang tangkap apa kuda liar. Ya, tangkap kuda liar begitu, and then orang migrate pergi Sabah. Dia punya bapak, my laki punya bapak, dia migrate pergi Sabah, and then di situ dia kerja balak. And then tahu after like few years kerja balak, mungkin reason politik, macam perubahan politik, dia suspek, and then after balak dia jadi nelayan, disendakan laut dalam. Enggak, pesisir laut kan.
Banyak yang membalap aku dekat.
Itu sajalah.
Thank you. Thanks, Kamer. Chinese migrant labor.
Oh yeah, something very interesting also I forgot to mention. Sabah is the only part in Southeast Asia where the northern Chinese came, but they could not tahan the environment, and then all of them quit. Northern Chinese people, their surname is not like the normal Wong, Tan and all that. They are like Fang, Dong, and very, very Mandarin kind of name. But they went back, they could not tahan. So it's the only place they came and tried, but cannot tahan.
What do you mean they cannot tahan? What they do?
These are northern Chinese. These are cold weather Chinese.
I know,
These
but
are
what
people-
did they do? What did they do? They went back. They jump in the sea. What did they do?
I think they went back. They ran back according to that paper.
Borrowing from that process earlier. In a way, a lot of what happened there manifested in some kind of developmental journey. Yeah. So building of schools, building of churches, building of roads, and all these things. So think about that as well.
I'm listening to all these stories about what was happening locally and how important those stories are, how rich they are. But then I was thinking, what is it that I can contribute as somebody not from here? And I was thinking about maybe something about the bigger political economic context in each era that shaped what happened locally. So that connect the big things you saw here with the economy. So we start with the 18th, 19th centuries. This is before colonization. The biggest thing that was, you had your subsistence economies, but the biggest thing that was shaping the economy of Sabah was the relationship between China and Europe. I know this is a surprise. It was a surprise to me when I read about it also. It's one of Cynthia's favorite books. Europe needed a lot of things from China. China needed nothing from Europe. So the European enterprise had to make a huge effort to find things that China needed. Where did it find things that China needed? It found them in the seas and forests of Borneo, Sulawesi, all those places. These were things Chinese needed, like birds' nests, tripang, all of these things. But You don't make those in Europe. So Europe put its effort on trying to get control of the trade to China of these forest and coastal products in Southeast Asia. And the way it did that was it found middlemen. It found local traders to do this. And most of those traders were people like the Suluks. So the British was able to get money from the Chinese so they could bring the things they wanted from China by encouraging the local trade. And that's how all, particularly the eastern side of Borneo, got so involved in producing all those things to sell to China. But what happened was that the middlemen that the British were creating got richer and richer and more powerful. And they moved from trading to slaving, to controlling the people to do that. So that whole rise of the strength of the Sulu Sultanate and these other things and all that slaving was the consequence of British, mainly British, but other European economic necessity of how to deal with China. So very interesting way to understand that type of slavery. Then you had the North Borneo Chartered Company with their CEO. Now, probably in school, you were told you were colonized by the British, but it's not true. You were not colonized by the British. You had a CEO. This CEO their job was to make money from North Borneo, of course, for their shareholders. To be very quick, the main way they shaped Borneo was this. They did not have enough capital to develop Borneo. They had some, they wasted it all on mega projects. They had their own Trans-Borneo highway and railway, and they wasted all that money. They didn't have any money after that. So the only way they could make money was to bring Chinese and tax the Chinese. And that's why Borneo had economic stagnation. They tried one after another cash crop agriculture. And as Casey said, only one of them made money, and that was for a short time. That was tobacco, because they didn't invest enough in it. Her great-grandfather's, I don't know what would you call him, William Pryor, who you saw, you put him on this thing here. William Pryor was one of those administrators. He tried everything to get the company to invest properly in conditions for commercial agriculture, but the company failed to do that well. So you had economic stagnation. They lived from taxing the Chinese. That was the economy of North Borneo, was to tax the Chinese to make money for wealthy people in London. Then along came the Japanese. So if the Second World War was the war between the industrial countries that had colonies and the industrial countries that did not have colonies, that was the Second World War. All those with colonies on one side, those with no colonies on the other side. So that's why Japan and Germany were united. Japan was pushed into the Second World War because the Europeans and the Americans were denying them access to raw materials and oil. I think it was in 1936, they stopped that. So what the problem that Japan had was that industrialization was being stopped. They wanted access to raw materials, but the Europeans were keeping them inside their colonies and saying you can't have. Inside Japan, the problem was the military was too strong and the civilian was too weak. So the army could see it's easy to defeat these Europeans. They're useless. But the civilians were not strong enough to say, you'll defeat them, but what about tomorrow? What you do afterwards? But the army's idea was that we defeat the Europeans, we create, what did they call it? The Asian Free Trade something zone. Not that word language, I forgot the name, but they had a word for it. They wanted to have free trade among free Asian nations. That was their idea. And they thought this would be such a good idea that the Europeans and Americans would not come back again to fight them for it. They didn't have a plan, basically. And their economy was so small, they couldn't support the military that the Americans could support. But that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to open free trade from Borneo, which had been stuck in monopoly capitalism with no investment money. The Japanese knew a lot about North Borneo. They were one of the few groups who invested in North Borneo, especially in the Tawau area. They knew how much economy there could be in Borneo if you actually had a modern economy, not this ancient British private company. Anyway, all that trade failed because they hadn't thought about air power. As soon as they moved a boat, the Americans or the British bombed it. That's why Borneo went into starvation, because even by the Second World War, Borneo already imported most of its rice, was not growing its rice, because the North Borneo Chartered Company never built roads. It was cheaper to bring rice from Vietnam than to build a road from the coast to where people were growing rice, to bring rice from inside. So that was the Japanese history. A good idea, completely failed because military error, ending, of course, in collapse. Then along came the British. The most colonization of the British was to make money, but not in North Borneo. In North Borneo, the British had three simple aims. One was, the most important one, control the expansion of communism from China and Southeast Asia. Number two, control the freedom movement that was happening in Indonesia after the end of the Second World War. Those were the two biggest ones. And the third one was prepare North Borneo for some kind of independence as cheaply as possible. Britain was in financial crisis after World War II. So nearly everything they did in Borneo was designed to make Borneo more economically self-sufficient, which is not the usual thing British colonization wanted to do, but it wanted to do it in Borneo. And that's why they built the economy from almost nothing, the end of Second World War, because the Americans, as she said, flattened the cities. North Borneo Chartered Company had been probably the worst British company in history, had done almost nothing. They built an economy incredibly quickly in those years. Why? Because they wanted to make North Borneo pay for itself. If you read their reports, their main aim is, how do we make an economy big enough for them to pay the British to look after North Borneo? Because we don't have any money. And we just want to make sure that we keep out communism because of all the other political consequences. So that was this strange British period, very strange. Now, because that's not normally how the British did it. But what did that mean in Borneo? That meant that suddenly economic opportunity was coming to the kampongs, because suddenly the road were there was some kind of market, they brought education, health. It was an interesting period of expansion without much. Normally when the British colonized, they destroyed indigenous rights very quickly. But they were not doing that in this period in Borneo because they were not interested in that. They just wanted everything to be quiet. And then we get to the modern period, and I learned a lot listening to this today. I was very, very interested. If you think about who successfully, at what stage in all of this history in Borneo was there real extraction of wealth from Sabah? It was in this period, starting in the 70s. So interesting, so really interesting, different kind of economy, because all that beautiful timber, all that agricultural potential had been here all this period. And almost nothing happened until the late 70s and the 80s. So it's very interesting to link, and you asked that question about how colonization happens.
And also at that time, during the PBS years, they took out a lot of timber in Sabah because there was the state had no money. So under the, I don't know what is this, under the agreements lah, the same with water, Sabah state money comes from tourism, timber, the land, things like water under state, not federal, right? So they took out timber desperately to finance the state. There was also a lot of corruption. this is the beginning of the end of Yayasan Sabah until there's a revival, hopefully. But the reasoning was that there was no federal money. So the state had no, because all the tax goes to federal, not to state.
I don't know whether this is correlating or not, because my experience looking at the forest, you know, now we are at the second or third cut. I walk into many forests in Sabah, you'll find that the best trees were logged in the 80s, in the late 80s. So I'm wondering whether the late 80s is the peak time where the timber are extracted. Because now you see the second and the third cycle, those trees are not very big anymore. It's quite small. So I think looking at the tree species and all that, probably in the late 80s was peak. So I don't know whether that correlates with history or not.
The interesting thing about this period of extractive economy and this period of destruction of native rights in Sabah is that the legal mechanisms to do extraction were put here, but not used effectively because the company was so useless. But all that legal framework has been very essential in this stage. The idea that everything in Sabah exists only for the purpose of economy is because you had a CEO. If you look at the whole structure of your legal code, it's about everything in Sabah is there for business.
In that same 80s period where so much timber is taken out is where that famous quote comes from. Do you want orangutan or you want gold? From Maliau Basin, right? So that there's a question that comes up, and then Sabahan people said, we want monkeys, not gold. That's a really significant moment, I think, by Sabahan people. We want Maliau Basin, not the gold.
What's the new opium?
Subsidy. That's one of the opium. It's opium. They also in slavery. There's before I can do anything.
Tunggu.
I cannot think. Yeah.
Wait. Okay. Wait.
I'm just acting the opium.
Bantuan, subsidies. What else? Huh?
Gula-gula politik.
Yeah.
There's also the federal money. Only federal money is necessary for everything.
Yeah,
Any
subsidy
federal money.
or funding.
Other things were said. I may have forgotten. Tender. So that's connected to project.
Bantuan all together.
Pangkat. Right.
Pelantikan. Last time we have to be born under the bird. Kesepian. Now you have to link the political line.
Power, political, is it political jawatan or what? Political position? Political what?
Influence.
Status?
Position.
Joe, you're addicted to high prices of oil palm. Is that what you're saying?
Then they will open more and more of their land.
Betul.
Yes.
You want to plant rice, but the price of the oil palm is higher. No more.
Do you think that maybe we're avoiding our problems?